The heavy scent of rust and sea salt hung in the air of the Incheon shipyard like a funeral shroud. Derek Lawson lunged forward, thrusting his burner phone into Naomi's face as if it were a loaded gun. "Look at it," he screamed, his voice cracking with a manic, desperate glee. "The Maid of Seoul, in her natural habitat. One click, and the First Lady of the CO Empire becomes the joke of the century. I have the power to destroy you, Tommy." Naomi didn't flinch. She stood perfectly still, her silver silk gown a sharp, shimmering contrast against the grime of the warehouse. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the distant, rhythmic crashing of the waves against the hull. Then, Naomi did something Derek never expected. She laughed. It was a low, melodic sound that chilled the air more than the winter wind. Derek stared at her, his jaw dropping as the broken maid he expected to see failed to appear. He had no idea that the woman standing before him wasn't hiding from her past, she was wielding it like a blade. He had no idea that while he was plotting a blackmail scheme in a cramped, nicotine-stained room, Naomi was already in the CEO's office, writing the headlines herself. He had no idea that the shameful photos he held were currently trending on the front page of every international news site, not as a scandal, but as a manifesto of survival. He certainly had no idea that the silent, red light blinking on the smoke detector above his head was broadcasting his every desperate word directly to a team of global investigators. But most lethally, Derek had no idea about the shift in the air behind him. He didn't hear the heavy iron doors locking from the outside. He didn't notice the silent, obsidian SUV idling just outside the perimeter, or the man stepping out of it with a gaze as cold as a Siberian winter. He didn't know that Jin-wook hadn't just come to protect his wife, he had come to witness a massacre of the Kong Syndicate's entire financial empire. As Naomi tilted her head, her almond eyes flashing with a predatory light, the realization began to sink in like a stone in the harbor. Derek hadn't found a secret to expose. He had walked into a floodlight. And in exactly 60 seconds, he was going to find out that you can't blackmail a woman who has already conquered her own ghosts. Welcome back, my fierce hearts and midnight dreamers. In part 1, the world saw a secret maid rise to become a queen. Tonight, the past tries to tear her down, but they forget who protects her. Before we finish this, take a second to subscribe, hit the like, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? Your love fuels these stories of dangerous protection and ultimate revenge. So, find your quiet place, let the world fade away, and let the obsidian take over. The final debt is due. Let's begin. The humidity of the Incheon outskirts felt like a damp shroud, clinging to the peeling yellow wallpaper of the room Derek now called home. It was a far cry from the glass and steel towers of Seoul. Here, the air smelled of salt, diesel, and failure. Derek sat on the edge of a stained mattress, staring at a tabloid image of Naomi. She was radiant, draped in emerald silk, standing beside a man who looked like he could command the sun to rise. The sight of her happiness was a jagged blade in Derek's gut. He remembered her scrubbing floors. Now, she was the woman the world bowed to. "You're just a maid," he rasped, his voice cracked from months of isolation. "You're nothing." A heavy, rhythmic pounding at the door startled him. Before he could move, the lock surrendered, and 2 men in slate-gray suits stepped into the squalor. They didn't look like Jin-wook's polished enforcers. They were sharper, colder, men who belonged to the Kong Syndicate, the only family with enough blood on their hands to rival the CO Empire. The lead man, a tall figure with a scar slicing through his eyebrow, surveyed the room with visible revulsion. He kicked a discarded ramen cup out of his path and looked at Derek. "Mr. Lawson," he said, his voice as dry as bone. "You look like a man who has lost everything but his grudges." Derek recoiled, his hand instinctively touching the faint, aching scar on his jaw. "Who sent you?" "People who find Jin-wook's First Lady a bit too perfect," the man replied, dropping a thick dossier onto the rickety table. Inside were blurred photos of Naomi in Atlanta, tired, wearing a uniform, carrying groceries for people who didn't know her name. "The chairman has built a pedestal for her. We want you to help us pull it down. Tell us every dirty secret, every debt, every moment of her shameful past." A slow, toxic grin spread across Derek's face. He had no money and no future, but he had the one thing that could still burn Naomi to the ground, the truth of where she came from. I'll give you everything, Derek whispered, his eyes gleaming with a newfound, desperate light. I'll make sure the whole world knows exactly what she used to be. The sanctuary of the Cartercio Foundation was usually a place of peace for Naomi, a glass-walled haven where she felt she finally held the reins of her own destiny. But lately, the sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows felt exposed, and the quiet hum of the office seemed to hide a jagged edge. As she reviewed grant applications for the new housing project, a cold prickle of unease settled at the base of her neck. She looked up, her gaze sweeping the bustling street below, but saw only the usual flow of Seoul's midday traffic. Still, the feeling remained, a heavy, invisible weight, as if a lens was trained directly on her heart. She tried to shake it off, adjusting the heavy platinum band on her finger as a grounding ritual, but her movements were tight and restless. When she returned to the penthouse that evening, she didn't have to say a word. Jin-wook was standing by the window, the city lights reflecting in his dark, impenetrable eyes. He watched the way she lingered at the door, the way her eyes darted toward the shadows of the hallway before she set her bag down. He saw the subtle tremor in her hands as she poured a glass of water, a ghost of the woman who had once lived in a state of constant, quiet terror. "You're far away tonight, Naomi," he said, his voice a low, soothing anchor. He crossed the room, placing a steadying hand on her waist, drawing her into his warmth. She leaned into him, her breath hitching. "I'm just tired," she lied softly, not wanting to admit that the shadows felt like they were reaching for her again. "It's probably nothing." Jin-wook didn't press her. He simply kissed the top of her head, his expression hardening into stone the moment she looked away. He knew her silence better than she knew herself. While Naomi tried to convince herself she was being paranoid, Jin-wook was already ahead of the threat. With a nearly imperceptible nod to his lead enforcer standing in the foyer, the quiet gears of his empire shifted. By morning, the number of unseen eyes protecting her would double. Every car following her would be trailed by two more. Every corner she turned would be cleared before her foot touched the pavement. He wouldn't tell her and risk fracturing her hard-won sense of freedom, but he would turn the city into a fortress around her. If the shadows wanted to watch her, they would have to face the monster that owned them. The morning sun filtered through the sheer curtains of the penthouse, casting long, elegant shadows across the marble floors. It was a day that should have felt like a triumph. The Foundation's latest project had just been approved, but the air in the room felt suddenly thin. On the obsidian console table in the foyer sat a single, heavy cream envelope. It bore no postmark, no return address, and no name, yet it commanded the space with a sinister gravity. Naomi picked it up, her fingers trembling slightly as she broke the wax seal. Inside was a single, glossy photograph. It wasn't the high-definition, regal imagery the public was used to seeing. This was grainy, taken from a distance years ago in Atlanta. In the photo, Naomi was dressed in a faded, ill-fitting maid's uniform, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion as she hauled heavy trash bags to a curb. Her face was etched with a weariness that she had fought so hard to bury. Across her younger, tired face, words had been scrawled in thick, aggressive black ink. "Never forget where you came from." The paper fluttered from her hand, hitting the floor like a physical blow. The room seemed to spin, the luxury of her current life suddenly feeling like a fragile glass house. The ghost of the woman in the photograph, the woman who had been invisible, belittled, and broken, rushed back to inhabit her skin. She felt the phantom sting of old insults and the cold weight of the poverty she had escaped. "Naomi!" Jin-wook's voice sliced through the ringing in her ears. He had entered the room with his usual silent grace, but his eyes immediately locked onto the fallen photograph. He moved with the predatory speed of a man who sensed blood in the water. Picking up the picture, he took in the image and the hateful script in a single, cold glance. He didn't flinch, but the muscles in his jaw tightened until they looked like cords of iron. He looked at the photo, then at his wife, whose breath was coming in shallow, panicked hitches. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He simply walked to her, took her face in his hands, and forced her to look at him. His eyes weren't filled with pity, but with a terrifying, absolute promise of retribution. The warning had been sent, but the sender had no idea that they hadn't just insulted a woman. They had just invited a god of war into their living room. Jin-wook did not shout, and he did not break the furniture. His anger had always been a deep-sea current, silent, invisible, and capable of crushing anything that descended into its depths. He stood in his private study, the lights dimmed to a soft amber, staring at the digital readout on a secure monitor. His team had traced the envelope's origin within the hour. The news that Derek Lawson had crawled back into Korea, backed by the Kong Syndicate, should have been an affront. Instead, it was a tactical error that Jin-wook intended to exploit with surgical precision. To Jin-wook, Derek was no longer a man. He was a symptom of a larger infection that needed to be cauterized. He pulled up the Kong Syndicate's financial portfolio, his eyes scanning the intricate web of shell companies and offshore accounts. The Kangs thought they were using Derek to bait him, but they had made the fatal mistake of underestimating what Jin-wook was willing to destroy to keep Naomi's peace intact. He picked up a burner phone and dialed a number that hadn't been used in 3 years. "Begin the short sell on Kong Logistics," he commanded, his voice as steady as a heartbeat. "I want their stock to bleed out by the opening bell. And find the foreman at their Incheon shipyard. Every man has a price, and if he doesn't, find out what he loves." This was the war mode that had made him a legend in the Seoul underworld, a cold, calculating stillness that preceded total annihilation. He wasn't going to just hit them, he was going to erase the foundation they stood on. He watched the data streams flicker across his face, his mind already 3 moves ahead. While Derek was likely celebrating his petty warning in some back-alley bar, Jin-wook was orchestrating a collapse that would leave the Kong family begging for the mercy of a prison cell. He would not tell Naomi the details. He would not let the soot of this battle touch her white silk carpets. He would simply remove the threat from the map, ensuring that by the time he was finished, the name Derek Lawson would be nothing more than a footnote in a history of losers. The shimmering chandeliers of the Latte Hotel ballroom cast a deceptive glow over the evening's festivities, the air thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the sharp clinking of crystal. Naomi moved through the crowd with the practiced grace of a queen, her arm tucked securely into Jin-wook's. She wore a gown of structured silver lame that made her look like a living blade, but beneath the surface, the memory of the photograph still felt like an open wound. She could feel the predatory gaze of the room, the way the elite watched her, waiting for a single crack in her royal facade. Jin-wook was a silent, looming presence at her side, his eyes scanning the room with the cold detachment of a predator in his own territory. They were stopped near the center of the floor by a group of investors, but the circle was quickly breached by a woman holding a digital recorder, her press badge swinging with a frantic energy. She wasn't one of the regular society reporters. There was a jagged, hungry light in her eyes that signaled a different kind of intent. "Mrs. Seo," the woman interjected, her voice cutting through the soft orchestral music like a serrated edge. "There are rumors circulating on the international blogs regarding your life before the chairman. Some say you weren't just a student in Atlanta, but that you were actually working as a common domestic maid for the very people your foundation now claims to empower. Tell us, does it feel hypocritical to play the philanthropist when you used to scrub the floors of the people you now look down upon?" The ballroom fell into a suffocating, crystalline silence. The whispers died instantly as heads turned, the socialites leaning in with a sick, voyeuristic curiosity. It was a calculated strike, designed to strip Naomi naked in front of the only people whose opinions were supposed to matter. Naomi felt the blood rush to her ears, the phantom scent of lemon ammonia and the ache of tired feet threatening to overwhelm her. For a heartbeat, she wasn't the First Lady of Seoul. She was the invisible girl in the faded uniform, discarded and small. Beside her, she felt Jin-wook's body go rigid, the temperature around him dropping to sub-zero as his hand tightened almost imperceptibly on hers. The trap had been sprung, and the entire city was watching to see if the queen would crumble. The silence in the ballroom was brittle, a frozen moment where the elite of Seoul held their collective breath. Naomi felt the sting of the journalist's words, but as she looked into the woman's hungry, desperate eyes, the fear that had haunted her for days suddenly evaporated. She realized that these people weren't wielding a weapon, they were wielding a mirror, and for the first time, she wasn't ashamed of the reflection. She didn't look at Jin-wook for help. Instead, she took a deliberate step forward, her silver gown shimmering like moonlight on water. She didn't flinch. She didn't even raise her voice. "You speak of scrubbing floors as if it is a stain on my character," Naomi said, her voice clear and resonant, carrying to the furthest corners of the silent hall. But there is no hypocrisy in my work. I know the weight of those tools and the ache of that labor because I lived it. I was a maid. I worked with my hands to survive, and I did so with a dignity that I suspect you wouldn't understand. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the socialites who had been ready to mock her, seeing their disdain shift into a sudden, uncomfortable respect. My foundation doesn't claim to empower. It exists because I know exactly what it feels like to be invisible. I don't look down on where I came from. I look back at it as the forge that made me strong enough to stand here today. If you intended to shame me with the truth of my hard work, you have failed. You have only reminded me why my mission is so necessary. A soft, hesitant ripple of applause started at the back of the room and grew into a steady roar. The journalist withered under the sudden, icy glares of the very elite she had tried to entertain. They saw her now not as a truth-teller, but as a crude instrument of a failing rival. Jin Wook's hand returned to the small of Naomi's back, his expression unreadable to the crowd, but his eyes burned with a fierce, quiet pride. The Kangs had tried to use her past as a cage, but Naomi had just turned it into a throne. The roar of the Gala's applause had long faded, but in the dim, nicotine-stained light of his hideout, Derek Lawson heard only the sound of his own heartbeat. He paced the small room like a caged animal, his mind twisting Naomi's triumph into a personal insult. He didn't see her grace as strength. He saw it as a performance, a lie she was telling the world. The Kangs had given him a burner phone and a renewed sense of purpose, and he clung to it with the ferocity of a drowning man. He truly believed he was the only one who held the key to her undoing, convinced that if he could just get her alone, the maid would reappear and crumble under his gaze. He sat at the rickety table, his fingers flying across the screen of the burner phone. His message was a jagged blade of desperation and arrogance. You think you won tonight? You haven't seen anything yet. You can play the queen for the cameras, but I know the girl who used to cry in my kitchen. Meet me at the old shipyard warehouse at midnight tomorrow. Alone. No guards, no husband. If you don't show, the international press gets the full story. The debts, the drinking, the real reason you ran. I'll burn your empire to the ground before you can say, Your Majesty. He hit send, a jagged, manic laugh escaping his throat. In his delusion, he imagined Naomi trembling in her silk sheets, terrified of the man who knew her shame. He didn't see the irony of a beggar threatening a queen. He only saw his own reflection as a conqueror reclaiming his lost property. He was so blinded by his need for revenge that he failed to notice the subtle, rhythmic blinking of a red light on the smoke detector above him. He didn't realize that every keystroke he made was being mirrored on a high-resolution screen in Jin Wook's study. Derek thought he was setting a trap, but he was merely walking deeper into the dark, unaware that the king was already standing at the exit, waiting to turn out the lights. The shipyard warehouse was a cavern of rusted iron and echoing ghosts, the air smelling of stagnant sea salt and ancient oil. Naomi stepped through the heavy sliding doors, the click of her heels on the concrete sounding like a ticking clock in the vast silence. She was dressed in a simple, obsidian black coat, her hair pulled back with a severity that matched her resolve. She looked small against the towering skeletons of half-finished hulls, but as she walked toward the single, flickering bulb at the center of the floor, she carried the weight of a woman who had already survived the worst of storms. Derek stepped out from behind a rusted pillar, his face pale and twisted into a mocking sneer. He looked haggard, a sharp contrast to the polished man she had once feared. You actually came, he rasped, his eyes darting to the shadows behind her. I told you to come alone. No bodyguards. No husband to hide behind. I am alone, Derek, Naomi replied, her voice steady, lacking even a tremor of the fear he craved. She stopped 10 feet away, the space between them an ocean of dead history. I didn't come because I'm afraid of your threats. I came because I wanted to see the man who thinks he can still hurt me. Derek took a step forward, his hands trembling with a mix of rage and desperate adrenaline. I can destroy you, Naomi. One phone call and your perfect life becomes a joke. You're just a maid who got lucky. Naomi didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. I wasn't lucky. I was resilient. And the woman you think you know, the one who would have cowered when you raised your voice, she died a long time ago. You have nothing but a handful of old photos and a heart full of rot. She watched him, her gaze cool and analytical. She knew that every word they spoke was being transmitted directly to Jinwook, who was positioned in a blacked-out SUV just 300 yards away, his finger hovering over a tactical deployment screen. She wasn't a victim walking into a trap, she was the bait in a much larger cage. For the first time, looking at Derek's frantic, hollow eyes, she didn't feel hatred. She felt a profound, chilling pity. He was a ghost trying to haunt a woman who had already moved into the light. Derek lunged forward, his face contorting as he brandished the burner phone like a weapon. "I have the press on speed dial, Naomi. One click and the headlines will read, 'The Maid of Seoul.' Your foundation, your husband's reputation, I'll tear it all down. Give me the money, or I'll make sure you can never show your face in this city again." He waited for the familiar flinch, the desperate plea, the tears he had feasted on for years. Instead, a soft, melodic sound echoed through the hollow warehouse. Naomi was laughing. It wasn't a laugh of hysteria, but one of genuine, cold amusement. She looked at him as if he were a ghost who hadn't realized he was dead. "You're always so far behind, Derek," she said, her voice cutting through the damp air. "Did you really think I'd sit in my penthouse waiting for a coward like you to strike?" She reached into her coat and pulled out her own device, turning the screen toward him. It was a live feed of an international news site. The headline was bold and unyielding, "From Shadows to Silk, the true story of Naomi Carter-Seo." Below it was an exclusive, long-form essay written by Naomi herself, detailing every floor she had scrubbed, every hardship she had endured, and every ounce of strength it took to survive men exactly like him. "I released the story an hour ago," Naomi said, her eyes flashing with a predatory light. "The world already knows. They aren't mocking me, Derek, they're inspired. My shame is now my greatest asset. I've turned your only weapon into my greatest strength. You have nothing left to expose because I've already stepped into the light." Derek's hand dropped, the burner phone suddenly feeling like a useless piece of plastic. The leverage he had built his entire identity around had evaporated in a heartbeat. He looked around the vast, dark warehouse, realizing for the first time that he wasn't the hunter, he was a rat who had walked into a floodlight. Naomi took a final step toward him, her presence overwhelming the space. "You didn't just lose your power over me, Derek," she whispered. "You lost your purpose. Now look behind you." Derek spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The shadows at the edge of the warehouse shifted, but it wasn't the Kong Syndicate coming to his rescue. Instead, the heavy steel doors he had entered through groaned shut with a final, echoing boom. The silence that followed was deafening. He reached for the burner phone to call his handlers, the men who had promised him a seat at the table once Naomi was ruined, but the screen remained stubbornly dark. Signal jammed. "They're coming for you," Derek hissed, though his voice lacked conviction. "The Kangs, they have more power than your husband ever dreamed of." Naomi didn't move. She simply watched him with a calm that was more terrifying than any scream. "The Kangs didn't want your secrets, Derek. They wanted a reason to lure Jinwook's security detail away from the shipping ports. You were never their partner. You were the tethered goat." Panic finally broke through Derek's delusion. He scrambled toward a side exit, his boots slipping on the oil-slicked concrete. He burst through a heavy door only to find himself on a narrow catwalk overlooking the dark harbor. Waiting there, illuminated by the harsh white glow of a single floodlight, was Jinwook. He looked like a statue carved from midnight, his hands clasped behind his back as he watched the Kong Syndicate's private freighter being boarded by a swarm of government agents in the distance. "Your friends are busy, Mr. Lawson," Jinwook said, his voice a low, lethal vibration that cut through the wind. "While you were playing at blackmail, I was handing the authorities the coordinates for the Kang's illegal cargo. They didn't use you to lure me out. I used you to keep them distracted while I dismantled their entire operation." Derek looked back at Naomi, then at the abyss of the harbor below. He realized with a sickening jolt that he was utterly alone. The Kangs had discarded him like trash the moment the first siren wailed, and Jinwook had let him play his hand just to ensure the trap was inescapable. Third had been caught in a maze of his own making, and the walls were finally closing in. The cold wind of the harbor whipped around Jinwook's coat as he pulled a slim, custom tablet from his pocket. The screen flickered with the chaotic red and green of a crashing market. For the Kong Syndicate, The night wasn't just a tactical failure, it was a total economic eclipse. Jin-wook had spent months planting seeds of doubt within their board of directors, and now, with their illegal shipments seized and their leadership in handcuffs, he was ready to harvest. "Watch," Jin-wook commanded, his voice devoid of heat. He turned the screen toward Derek, who stood trembling on the edge of the catwalk. With a few precise taps, Jin-wook initiated a series of pre-programmed, high-frequency trades. The Kong family's legacy, built on decades of corruption and intimidation, began to dissolve in real time. Their stock plummeted into a freefall as Jin-wook's shell companies moved in like a school of sharks, snapping up every devalued share. By the time the sun rose, the Kong syndicate would no longer exist. Their assets, their real estate, and even the very shipyard they stood in would belong to the CO group. Derek watched the numbers spiral toward zero, the reality of his insignificance finally sinking in. The powerful men who had promised him a life of luxury were being wiped off the map by a man who hadn't even broken a sweat. The Kangs were being stripped of their titles and their bank accounts, reduced to the same state of wretchedness they had used to entice Derek. "You thought they were your salvation," Jin-wook said, tucking the device away as if he had just finished a mundane chore. "But they were just another debt I decided to collect. They are penniless, Derek. Just like you. There is no one left to call. No one to pay for your silence, and no one to protect you from what comes next." The silence that followed was absolute. The empire that had emboldened Derek's malice had been dismantled with the stroke of a key. He was standing in the ruins of a war he never truly understood, looking into the eyes of a man who didn't just win battles. He ended worlds. If you're enjoying this so far, hit like and subscribe for more Syndicate Soul stories. Let me know in the comments what you think happens next. Alright, let's keep going. The rain began as a thin, freezing mist, slicking the asphalt of the private garage where Naomi's armored sedan waited. The silence was absolute until the screech of metal on metal tore through the air. Derek had bypassed the outer perimeter, fueled by a manic, jagged desperation that had stripped away the last of his reason. He lunged from behind a concrete pillar, a heavy tire iron clutched in his white-knuckled grip. He wasn't looking for money or leverage anymore, he was looking for blood. He swung the iron at the rear window where Naomi sat, the impact echoing like a gunshot, but the reinforced glass didn't even spiderweb. "Come out!" Derek screamed, his voice breaking into a jagged sob of rage. "You ruined me! You think you're untouchable? I made you!" He swung again, the vibration rattling his own bones, but the car remained a silent, obsidian fortress. The driver's side door didn't open. Instead, a shadow detached itself from the far wall of the garage. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and carried the weight of a funeral march. Jin-wook stepped into the harsh fluorescent light, shedding his overcoat and tossing it onto the hood of a nearby car. He didn't signal his guards to intervene. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply unbuttoned his cuffs and rolled his sleeves with a terrifying, surgical calm. Derek spun around, the tire iron raised, but his bravado withered as he looked into Jin-wook's eyes. There was no corporate coldness there now, only a raw, primal promise of pain. "You touched her once," Jin-wook said, his voice a low, lethal hum. "I let my men handle the first debt. This one belongs to me." Derek lunged, a clumsy, desperate arc of steel, but Jin-wook moved like smoke. He caught Derek's wrist midair, the sound of snapping bone muffled by the rain, and disarmed him with a single, brutal twist. Before Derek could even scream, Jin-wook's fist connected with his jaw, a strike delivered with the full weight of a husband's fury. Derek hit the concrete hard, the world spinning into a blur of gray and red. He looked up to see Jin-wook standing over him, not as a chairman, but as a storm that had finally made landfall. Derek lay sprawled on the wet concrete, the copper tang of blood filling his mouth. Every breath was a jagged reminder of the ribs Jin-wook had just cracked. Above him, the chairman stood silhouetted against the harsh garage lights, his breathing steady, his knuckles reddened but unbroken. Jin-wook didn't look down at him with hatred. That would have required a level of respect Derek no longer commanded. He looked down at him as one might look at a broken piece of glass on a clean floor, a nuisance to be swept away. "You have spent your life believing you are the protagonist of a tragedy," Jin-wook said, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt heavier than the blows he had delivered. But you are merely a ghost I have grown tired of seeing. He reached into his pocket and dropped a thick, manila envelope onto Derek's chest. It contained a forged passport, a one-way ticket to a remote corner of Eastern Europe, and enough cash to buy a life of silent obscurity. This is your first option. You leave tonight. You take a new name. You never speak the name Naomi again. You disappear into the gray world you deserve, and you never, under any circumstances, return to this soil. Derek clutched the envelope, his fingers trembling, but his eyes darted toward the shadows where Jin-wook's security teams stood like statues. He opened his mouth to spit a final defiance, but the words died as Jin-wook leaned closer, his eyes turning into twin voids of cold calculation. The second option, Jin-wook continued, is that I walk away and let my men take you to the basement of the Incheon shipyard. There are no cameras there. There are no tabloids. There is only a very long, very painful silence that ends in a shallow grave that no one will ever find. The Kangs are already there. They are blaming you for their ruin. I imagine they would be very happy to see you. The choice wasn't a choice at all, it was a stay of execution. Derek looked at the passport, then back at the man who had systematically dismantled his entire existence. The realization finally took root. The woman he had tried to destroy was now protected by a god who didn't believe in second chances. Derek didn't say a word. He clutched the envelope to his bruised chest and began to crawl toward the exit, the shadow of the king looming over him for the very last time. The transition from the dark, oil-slicked garage to the sterile, blinding lights of Incheon International Airport's private hangar was a blur of pain and terror for Derek. He was flanked by two of Jin-wook's silent enforcers, men who didn't speak, didn't blink, and treated him with the clinical detachment of baggage handlers moving a hazardous crate. His original passport, the last remaining tie to his former life as a high-flying executive, was taken from his trembling hands and incinerated in a portable burner right before his eyes. The ashes were scattered onto the tarmac, a silent metaphor for his identity. This is the only mercy you will receive, the lead guard whispered as they reached the stairs of a nondescript cargo plane. From this moment on, Derek Lawson is dead. You are a ghost with a nameless face, heading to a place where no one will ever know you. Derek looked at the plane, then back at the skyline of Seoul, shimmering like a jewel he had tried to steal and broken in the process. He thought of Naomi, safe in her palace, and realized that her greatest victory wasn't her wealth or her title, it was that she had forgotten him entirely. He was being purged from her world like a toxin from a healthy body. As he was shoved into the belly of the aircraft, he saw a black sedan idling on the perimeter. The tinted glass didn't roll down, but he knew Jin-wook was watching. There was no luggage, no farewell, and no hope. The engines began to roar, a primal sound that drowned out the frantic pleading in his head. As the wheels left the ground, a final, chilling realization settled in his gut. The borders of Korea were now a wall of fire. If he ever attempted to return, if he ever whispered her name to a soul, the silence that followed would be permanent. He was being cast out into a cold, empty world, knowing that the only reason he was breathing was because a king had decided that killing him was beneath a queen's notice. If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more Syndicate Soul stories. Let me know in the comments what you think will happen next. Now, let's find out. The morning mist clung to the Han River like a fading memory, but on the high balcony of the CO penthouse, the air was crisp and remarkably clear. Naomi stood at the railing, the wind catching the hem of her cream silk robe. She looked out over the city that had once felt like a labyrinth of judgment, but now, it felt like home. The headlines about her past had long since shifted from scandal to a narrative of triumph, cementing her as a symbol of resilience for women across the globe. She was no longer the girl scrubbing floors in the dark. She was the architect of a new kind of power, one built on the truth rather than the suppression of it. A pair of strong, familiar arms wrapped around her waist, and she felt the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of Jin-wook against her back. He pressed a kiss to the curve of her neck, his presence a silent vow that had been tested and found unbreakable. The enemies who had tried to weaponize her history were gone, one erased into a nameless life of exile, the others dismantled and forgotten in the gears of a corporate machine they thought they controlled. The silence between them was no longer filled with the tension of secrets, but with the profound peace of a battle won. The world is quiet today, Jin-wook murmured, his hands resting gently over hers. Naomi shifted her gaze downward, her hands moving instinctively to the slight, soft curve of her stomach. A new life was growing there, a CEO legacy that would be born into a world where their mother's name was spoken with reverence, not whispered in shame. This child would never know the sting of a uniform or the weight of a shadow, for the path ahead had been cleared by fire and gold. As the sun broke over the horizon, bathing the glass towers in a blinding, triumphant light, Naomi leaned back into her husband's strength. The ghosts of Atlanta were finally silent, and the Queen was no longer playing a part. She was exactly where she was meant to be, standing at the helm of an unstoppable empire, watching the dawn of a future that belonged entirely to them. The journey of Naomi and Jin Wook serves as a powerful testament to the idea that your past is a foundation, not a prison. The primary moral lesson here is that true dignity is found in resilience, not in the absence of hardship. Naomi's story teaches us that shame is often a weapon used by those who fear our potential. By owning her history as a maid, she stripped her enemies of their power and transformed her scars into her greatest strength. Furthermore, the story highlights the inevitable downfall of those fueled by malice. Derek and the Kong Syndicate operated on the belief that they could control others through fear and blackmail. However, Jin Wook's calculated response reminds us that integrity and strategic silence will always outlast loud, desperate threats. When you stop running from where you came from, you become unstoppable. Thank you so much for following this saga to its powerful conclusion. Your support means the world to us as we bring these stories of triumph and justice to life. If you found inspiration in Naomi's rise to power, please like this video and share it with someone who needs a reminder of their own strength. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new chapter. See you in the next.